The morning mist clung to Lexington Green like a shroud as Captain John Parker stood with his 77 Minutemen, their muskets gleaming with dew in the pale dawn light of April 19, 1775. The thunder of British boots on cobblestone had awakened the sleeping village. And now Major John Pitcairn's advance guard of His Majesty's Marines emerged from the fog like specters of war. "Stand your ground," Parker whispered to his men, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The words would echo through history, though in that moment they were merely the desperate plea of a militia captain facing professional soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's column of 700 British regulars had marched through the night from Boston. Their red coats now dusty from the 20-mile trek, their mission was clear: seize the colonial weapons cache at Concord and arrest the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. What they hadn't anticipated was the efficiency of Paul Revere's midnight ride and the network of riders who had spread the alarm across the Massachusetts countryside. As per historical accounts documented in the Boston Gazette, the confrontation began when Pitcairn rode forward, his sword gleaming in the morning sun. "Disperse, the rebels." "Damn you! Dispersed!" he shouted at the assembled militiamen. The tension crackled like lightning before a storm, each side eyeing the other with the wariness of men who knew that history balanced on a knife's edge. Parker, realizing his small force was vastly outnumbered, began to order his men to disperse. But in the chaos of shouted commands and nervous energy, a musket fired. To this day, historians debate whether it came from British or colonial ranks, but the sound shattered the morning calm like glass. In the confusion that followed, British soldiers opened fire and 8 Americans fell dead on Lexington Green, their blood seeping into the Massachusetts soil. The British regulars, their discipline momentarily shattered by the unexpected violence, quickly reformed under their officers' commands. They had drawn first blood, but the taste of victory was bitter. As they prepared to march on to Concord, none could have imagined that this brief skirmish would unleash a fury that would pursue them all the way back to Boston. Behind stone walls and in farmhouse windows, more militiamen watched the British column pass. The alarm bells had done their work well, and across the countryside, men were grabbing their muskets and powder horns, leaving their plows and workshops to answer the call to arms. The British had won the first encounter, but they had also awakened a sleeping giant. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, the British column marched on toward Concord, their fifes and drums playing martial airs that seemed oddly out of place in the peaceful countryside. They had no way of knowing that every step took them deeper into a trap that was closing around them, or that the scattered shots fired at Lexington Green would soon become a continuous thunder of colonial musket fire that would follow them home. The British column moved with the measured precision of professional soldiers, their red coats a stark contrast against the green Massachusetts countryside. Lieutenant Colonel Smith maintained his steady pace, though reports from his scouts grew increasingly troubling. Colonial militiamen were gathering in unprecedented numbers, emerging from farms and villages like ants from a disturbed hill. Captain Lawrence Parsons commanded the light infantry companies at the column's head, his experienced eye noting the subtle signs of hostile territory. Smoke signals rose from distant hilltops, and the roads that should have been filled with morning farm traffic stood eerily empty. The colonials were organizing, and every British officer knew that an organized colonial militia was far more dangerous than a scattered rabble. As they approached Concord, the British could see the North Bridge spanning the Concord River, its wooden planks gleaming in the morning sunlight. The town itself seemed peaceful enough, but Smith's instincts, honed by years of military service, told him otherwise. He deployed his forces according to established tactical doctrine. Captain Parsons would take 3 companies to secure the North Bridge and search for hidden weapons, while Captain Mundy Pole would lead another detachment to the South Bridge. The main body of British troops entered Concord at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, their drums beating the march that had carried them across countless battlefields in Europe. The townspeople watched from behind shuttered windows as the redcoats took control of their village square. But there was no panic, no desperate flight. Instead, there was an unsettling calm, as if the entire town was holding its breath. According to documentation from the Massachusetts Historical Society, Colonel James Barrett had spent the previous weeks moving the colonial weapons cache from Concord to safer locations throughout the countryside. The British would find some supplies: flour, wooden spoons, and a few outdated cannon, but the major arsenal they sought had vanished like morning mist. The colonials had outmaneuvered them before the battle had even begun. Meanwhile, on the hills surrounding Concord, militia companies continued to gather. Captain David Brown arrived with his Bedford Minutemen, their faces grim with determination. Major John Buttrick led the Concord militia, men who knew every stone wall and woodland path in the area. They positioned themselves on the high ground overlooking the North Bridge, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. The British search parties worked methodically through the town, their frustration growing as they found little of military value. They discovered some cannonballs, which they rolled into the mill pond, and set fire to some wooden gun carriages, sending dark smoke billowing into the morning sky. To the watching militiamen on the surrounding hills, the smoke looked like the town itself was burning. Captain Parsons reached the North Bridge and posted a small guard before continuing his search of the Barrett farm. He left only a handful of men to hold the bridge, a decision that would prove fateful. The wooden structure suddenly became the most important tactical position in Massachusetts, the key to controlling the British retreat route back to Boston. As the morning wore on, the militia companies on the hills began to move. What had started as scattered groups of angry farmers was transforming into a coordinated military force. The British had come to Concord expecting to face a mob. Instead, they found themselves confronting an army that was rapidly learning the art of war. The stage was set for the confrontation that would transform a punitive expedition into a fighting retreat, and turn a colonial rebellion into a revolution that would shake the foundations of the British Empire. The tension at North Bridge reached its breaking point, as Colonel Barrett's militiamen watched smoke rise from their beloved town. From their position on the hills, they could see British soldiers moving through Concord's streets. The dark smoke convinced many that the Redcoats were putting their homes to the torch. The sight transformed their defensive posture into aggressive determination. Major John Buttrick assembled the militia companies with the efficiency of a seasoned commander. The Concord Minutemen stood shoulder to shoulder with companies from Bedford, Lincoln, and Acton, their ranks swelling to over 400 men. These were not the scattered farmers the British had expected, but disciplined citizens who had trained for months in anticipation of this very moment. Captain Walter Laurie commanded the British detachment guarding the North Bridge with just 96 men from the King's Own Regiment and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He had positioned his soldiers on the Concord side of the bridge, following standard military doctrine for defending a river crossing. However, his small force was woefully inadequate for the task at hand, and he knew it. The Americans began their advance down the hill in perfect formation, their muskets at the ready. Captain Isaac Davis of the Acton Militia led the advance, his company having volunteered for the honor of spearheading the assault. Behind him marched Captain David Brown's Bedford Company, followed by the Concord Minutemen under Major Buttrick's direct command. As documented in the diary of Reverend William Emerson, who witnessed the battle from his nearby parsonage, the British soldiers at the bridge began to retreat across the span. As the colonial force approached, Captain Laurie attempted to maintain an orderly withdrawal, but his men were clearly unnerved by the sight of so many armed colonists advancing with military precision. The British soldiers began tearing up the bridge planks in a desperate attempt to slow the American advance. This action further enraged the militiamen, who saw it as an attempt to trap them on the wrong side of the river. Major Buttrick's voice rang out across the morning air. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" The first colonial volley crashed across the bridge like thunder. Captain Davis fell instantly, a British musket ball through his heart, becoming one of the first American officers to die in the Revolution. Private Abner Hosmer of Acton dropped beside him, his life bleeding out onto the wooden planks of the bridge that would soon bear his name in local memory. The British return fire was ragged and poorly aimed. Several redcoats fell, including Captain Laurie himself, wounded in the hand but continuing to command his men. The professional soldiers who had marched so confidently from Boston now found themselves facing disciplined fire from men who had hunted in these woods since childhood. The Americans pressed forward across the bridge, their momentum carrying them past the British position. The Redcoats, outnumbered more than 4-1, began a fighting withdrawal toward the town center. Their training held, but their morale was shaken. These colonial militia were not the rabble they had been led to expect. In the space of just a few minutes, the strategic situation had completely reversed. The British, who had come to Concord as hunters, now found themselves the hunted. The North Bridge had become the turning point where a punitive expedition transformed into a desperate retreat, and where colonial resistance evolved into revolutionary warfare. As the gunsmoke cleared from the bridge, both sides realized that something fundamental had changed. The British could no longer count on colonial submission, and the Americans had discovered that they could stand against the world's most professional army. The revolution that had begun with a single shot at Lexington Green was now a burning reality that would consume both nations for the next 8 years. The British situation in Concord deteriorated rapidly as news of the fight at North Bridge spread through the countryside like wildfire. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, his confidence shaken by reports of the engagement, realized that his 700 men were now isolated in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy force that was growing larger by the hour. Captain Parsons and his search parties returned from the Barrett farm with disappointing results. The colonial weapons cache had been well hidden or removed entirely, leaving the British with little to show for their dangerous mission. More alarming still were the reports from his scouts. Militia companies were converging on Concord from every direction, their numbers estimated at well over 1,000 men. The American forces were organizing with surprising efficiency under the leadership of experienced officers like Colonel Barrett and Major Buttrick. These were men who had served in the French and Indian War, and they understood both conventional tactics and the unique advantages of fighting on their home ground. They positioned their companies to control the roads leading back to Boston, preparing to turn the British retreat into a running gauntlet. As per the account recorded in the Essex Gazette, Dr. Samuel Prescott had continued his midnight ride beyond Lexington, carrying Paul Revere's warning to towns throughout Middlesex County. The result was a mobilization unprecedented in colonial history, with militia companies marching through the night to reach the battlefield. Companies from Reading, Woburn, Medford, and Cambridge were already on the road, their muskets loaded and their powder horns full. Smith recognized that his position was becoming untenable. The original plan had called for a quick strike to seize rebel supplies and leaders, followed by an orderly return to Boston. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a hornet's nest. With colonial forces controlling the high ground and threatening his line of retreat, the mission had failed, and now survival became the paramount concern. The British commander made the difficult decision to begin withdrawing from Concord immediately. His men formed up in the town square, their redcoats now dusty and their faces grim with the realization that they were walking into a trap. The fifes and drums that had played so confidently on the march out now sounded hollow and ominous. Meanwhile, the American militia companies positioned themselves along the route back to Boston, using their intimate knowledge of the local terrain to maximum advantage. Captain Jonathan Wilson's Reading Company took positions behind stone walls near Miriam's Corner, while Captain Samuel Thatcher's men from Cambridge occupied the high ground overlooking the road. The British advance guard, commanded by Major Pitcairn, began the retreat from Concord at approximately noon. Behind them, the main column stretched out along the narrow country road, vulnerable to attack from the wooded hills on either side. The professional soldiers who had marched out with such confidence now found themselves in a nightmare scenario, retreating through hostile territory under constant observation by an enemy they couldn't see. As the last British soldiers left Concord, the militia companies began to move. They flowed through the countryside like water, using farm paths and woodland trails to position themselves ahead of the retreating column. The hunters had become the hunted, and the road back to Boston would soon become a killing ground. The stage was set for one of the most famous running battles in American history, where citizen soldiers would prove that they could match the world's finest professional army through courage, determination, and intimate knowledge of their homeland. The British retreat from Concord was about to become a legend that would inspire generations of Americans to come. The British column had barely cleared Concord's outskirts when the first shots rang out from behind stone walls and woodland shadows. Miriam's Corner, where the road crossed a small bridge. Captain Jonathan Wilson's Reading militia opened fire on the retreating redcoats with devastating effect. The narrow roadway became a killing ground, with British soldiers falling beneath the disciplined volleys of men who had learned to shoot hunting deer in these same woods. Major Pitcairn's advance guard attempted to maintain order, But the traditional European tactics of his men were useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the open. The Americans would fire from concealment, then melt away through the forest. Before the British could respond, it was warfare unlike anything the professional soldiers had experienced, and their training had not prepared them for such unconventional tactics. The retreating column stretched out along the narrow country road, becoming increasingly vulnerable as panic began to set in among the ranks. British officers shouted orders, trying to maintain the discipline that had made their army legendary across Europe. But their men were being picked off by an invisible enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Captain Samuel Thatcher's Cambridge Company struck next, their muskets flashing from behind the stone walls that lined the Massachusetts countryside. The British soldiers, loaded down with heavy packs and exhausted from their night march, could barely return fire before their tormentors disappeared into the landscape they knew so intimately. According to the detailed account published in the Boston Evening Post, the American militia companies coordinated their attacks with remarkable efficiency. As one company engaged the British column, others would move ahead to prepare the next ambush. The retreating redcoats found themselves running a gauntlet that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. With no relief in sight, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, wounded in the thigh by a colonial musket ball, struggled to maintain control of his disintegrating command. His men were beginning to break ranks, running instead of marching. Their military discipline eroded by the constant harassment from an enemy they couldn't see or effectively engage. The orderly retreat was becoming a rout. The British soldiers began abandoning their heavy equipment, leaving behind muskets, cartridge boxes, and personal belongings in their desperate flight toward Boston. The road became littered with the debris of a professional army in full retreat, a testament to the effectiveness of American militia tactics. At the town of Lincoln, Captain William Smith's company joined the growing swarm of militiamen harassing the British column. The Americans had learned to work together instinctively, communicating through horn calls and hand signals, moving like a pack of wolves around their prey. Each company knew its role in the larger strategy, and they executed their attacks with the precision of veterans. The British casualties mounted steadily as the retreat continued. Officers fell alongside enlisted men, their bright gorgets and distinctive uniforms making them prime targets for colonial marksmen. The professional army that had marched so confidently from Boston was being systematically destroyed by farmers and shopkeepers who had become soldiers in defense of their homeland. By the time the British column reached the outskirts of Lexington, they were in complete disarray. What had begun as a disciplined withdrawal had become a desperate flight for survival. The citizen soldiers of Massachusetts had proven that they could not only stand against the world's finest professional army, but could beat them at their own game through superior tactics and unbreakable determination. The retreat from Concord was transforming into one of the most decisive small unit actions in military history, proving that the American spirit of independence was more than just political rhetoric, was a force that could change the course of nations. The British column stumbled into Lexington in complete disorder, their ranks broken and their morale shattered by the relentless harassment of the American militia. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, blood seeping through his uniform from his wounded thigh, could barely maintain his saddle as he watched his once proud command disintegrate before his eyes. The professional soldiers who had marched out with such confidence were now a frightened mob, running for their lives down the dusty Massachusetts roads. Just when complete disaster seemed inevitable, the sound of British fifes and drums echoed across Lexington Green. Brigadier General Hugh Percy had arrived with reinforcements, 1,200 fresh troops, and 2 6-pounder cannon that would change the entire dynamic of the battle. The battered remnants of Smith's column collapsed behind Percy's defensive line. Gasping for breath and checking their wounds, General Percy, a veteran of European campaigns, quickly assessed the situation with the eye of an experienced commander. He positioned his artillery on the high ground overlooking the road, their bronze barrels commanding the approaches to the town. The Massachusetts militia, who had been closing in for what they believed would be the final destruction of the British force, found themselves facing a completely new tactical situation. The American militia commanders, led by Colonel Barrett and Major Buttrick, recognized the changed circumstances immediately. The arrival of Percy's relief column had transformed a pursuit into a siege, and the colonial forces lacked the heavy weapons necessary to assault a properly defended position. They pulled back beyond the range of the British cannon, regrouping to consider their next move. As documented in the memoirs of General Percy himself, the British general was impressed by the fighting qualities of the American militia. These were not the undisciplined rabble that British intelligence had reported, but organized military units led by competent officers who understood both strategy and tactics. The colonials had nearly destroyed a professional British force through superior knowledge of the terrain and innovative tactical methods. Percy's artillery opened fire on the American positions, the six-pounder balls crashing through stone walls and splintering trees. The colonists, who had never faced artillery fire before, initially gave ground before the thunderous bombardment. However, they quickly adapted, using the rolling terrain to avoid the British cannon fire, while maintaining pressure on the enemy flanks. The British commander realized that his position in Lexington, while temporarily secure, was ultimately untenable. More colonial militia companies were arriving every hour, and his ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. The mission had failed completely, and now his primary objective was to extract his combined force of nearly 2,000 men before they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Captain John Parker, the militia commander whose men had first faced the British at dawn, watched the enemy preparations from behind a stone wall. His company had been reduced to less than half its original strength, but the survivors were determined to see the fight through to its conclusion. They had started something at dawn that would not end until the British were driven from Massachusetts soil. As the afternoon wore on, Percy made the difficult decision to continue the retreat toward Boston. His men formed up in good order, protected by the disciplined fire of his artillery. But everyone knew that the road ahead would be just as dangerous as the route from Concord. The American militia had tasted victory, and they would not be easily discouraged. The British column began moving again, this time with Percy's fresh troops serving as both advance guard and rear guard. The artillery pieces rolled along the road, their crews ready to unlimber and fire at a moment's notice. The retreat from Concord was entering its final phase, but the most dangerous miles still lay ahead. The Massachusetts militia, bloodied but unbowed, prepared to continue their pursuit. They had learned valuable lessons about fighting professional soldiers, and they were eager to apply that knowledge. The revolution that had begun with a single shot would continue until the last British soldier was driven from their homeland. The British column resumed its retreat from Lexington with General Percy's reinforcements providing much-needed tactical cohesion. But the American militia had learned from their morning's work and adapted their tactics accordingly. The colonial forces now numbered over 3,000 men, with fresh companies arriving from towns throughout eastern Massachusetts. They had transformed from scattered resistance into a coordinated military force that shadowed the British retreat like a gathering storm. The Americans had positioned themselves along every mile of the route back to Boston, using the natural terrain to maximum advantage. Stone walls, wooded hills, and farmhouse positions created overlapping fields of fire that turned the narrow country road into a deadly corridor. The British artillery proved effective when the militia exposed themselves. But the colonists quickly learned to remain hidden until the perfect moment to strike. At Menotomy, present-day Arlington, the fighting reached its most intense level of the entire day. The town's buildings provided cover for American marksmen, who engaged the British column in vicious house-to-house fighting. Captain Samuel Whitmore, a veteran of the French and Indian War at age 78, single-handedly engaged a British patrol, killing 3 soldiers before being bayoneted and left for dead. He would survive his wounds and become a legend of American determination. The British soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, began to break under the constant pressure. Percy's disciplined troops maintained their formation, but Smith's original column was barely holding together. British casualties mounted steadily, with officers falling at an alarming rate, as colonial marksmen targeted the leaders of the retreating force, according to the detailed account recorded in the Pennsylvania Gazette. The American militia demonstrated remarkable tactical innovation throughout the running battle. They used horn calls to coordinate their movements, employed relay systems to maintain continuous pressure on the British flanks, and utilized their superior knowledge of local terrain to repeatedly outmaneuver the professional soldiers. The British column's ammunition began running critically low as the afternoon wore on. Percy's artillery crews were down to their last rounds, and the infantry companies were scraping the bottom of their cartridge boxes. The general realized that his force was facing potential annihilation, if they didn't reach the safety of Boston soon. At Cambridge, the final major engagement of the day erupted as local militia companies made a desperate attempt to cut off the British retreat entirely. The fighting was fierce and personal, with colonists defending their own neighborhoods against an army they now saw as invaders rather than protectors. The British managed to fight their way through, but only at the cost of heavy casualties. As the sun began to set, the exhausted British column finally reached the outskirts of Boston and the protection of the Royal Navy's guns. The American militia, having pursued their enemy for over 20 miles, finally halted their advance as darkness fell. They had accomplished something that many had thought impossible. They had defeated a professional European army in open combat. The retreat from Concord had cost the British 273 casualties, including 73 dead and 200 wounded or missing. The American losses were 95 total casualties, with 49 dead. More importantly, the colonial militia had proven that they could stand against the world's most powerful military force and emerge victorious. The shots fired at Lexington Green that morning had indeed been heard round the world, as Ralph Waldo Emerson would later write. The American Revolution had begun not with a declaration or a formal battle, but with ordinary citizens taking up arms to defend their homes and their rights. The British retreat from Concord had shown that the colonial rebellion was not a passing disturbance, but a genuine revolution that would reshape the political landscape of the entire world. The Massachusetts militia returned to their homes that night as victors, but they knew that the real war was just beginning. The British would return with larger forces and better preparation, but the Americans had discovered something invaluable. They could fight, they could win, and they could forge a new nation from the crucible of battle. The tide had turned on April 19, 1775, and there would be no going back.